which is the perfect place to bring up probably today's most difficult thing to tell, her phone. Well, not the phone itself, pink and rad, average number of texts. It's not like Mephisto put Xanther's number out there. Anwar would have gone dove mad if Mephisto had gone that far. Astaire even worse. No, this is about the horror sphere. Mayumi already warned her this morning. They all did in texts. Mayumi. Most SETIs got it, Cogs. Bye-Bye got it the worst, Byard. Bye-Bye's cool like a jewel, Clay. DGAF burned their lives down. Josh. IMHO. I look better. Some creepy app called Mute All Hate. Emoji makes it way harder for the adults to catch on, Clay claims. And with good reason. The app's way sicker than Ugly Booth or Zombie Booth. Does with pixels what knives and rusty can openers could do to your face. Dove, I know, would do something. He'd stand up for his friend, and I know I should for Byard, but I don't know how. Dendish comes near, and I mean, like, I even see him down the hall, and I freeze. Talk about Frady K. Xanther can't even look at some pictures on her phone. You're not going to tell Les Parents. Should I? Dove could look at anything in the eye. I can't. Not even my friends, my parents, not even you. As if to prove it too, Xanther tries to focus on Dr. Potts' eyes. Keep there for what, a second? And though she finds nothing but warmth, she doesn't last, not even a second, because, like, what's he looking at and how at her? And with her looking at him too, probably understanding something she's thinking without her understanding what she's thinking. And no question it's something like she'll have to do something about, right? Especially if she keeps this up, this looking at him, right? Something she won't know how to respond to or defend or answer. The edges of the room darkening, temperatures dropping, and all because of two concentric rings of blue, tiny too, surrounding an even tinier dot, black dot. Before Xanther skitters helplessly off to the bridge of Dr. Potts' nose, to his beard, all the salt and pepper hair around his lips, retreating even further to relief, blind, unthinking, and certainly questionless, the last tile twisting into place, at least, as Xanther whispers, defeated. See? Dr. Potts smiles at her victory. A mess of color on 5 sides, but with the 6th all white. Progress, well done. Now tell me one last thing, whatever comes to mind, as we only have a minute left. Dr. Potts often says this. Xanther figures it's a time's up technique. But does he do it with all his patients or just Xanther? Not that she objects, she'd hate to impose on him, let alone on Anwar waiting for her outside, taking extra time. That would mortify her. Did his life flash before his eyes? What? Dr. Potts looks caught off guard, even a little bewildered. Who? Before he died, Dove, you know, did like his life really flash before his eyes? Oh. What? That's not what you said. I didn't? Did his love flash before his eyes? That's what I said? Dr. Potts nods. Are you sure? Yes. And I'm sure it did. Thank you. So any questions? I think there was a cup of water. I have a question. I know, the question you're all wanting to ask. Yes, I am a feminist. Did everyone hear the question? Yes? Gosh. The question of voice is such a great one, and it's kind of haunted me for a long time. I remember I was being interviewed by Malcolm Jones of Newsweek for House of Leaves, and it was one of those old school interviews, which means it was great. He flew out to LA, and we spent 2 days just talking, and he distilled all of that down to 500 words. And unfortunately, a lot of what we talked about wasn't in his review, but we did stumble onto this question of whether image has voice. You know, can we look at a de Kooning or a Pollock or a Damien Hirst and see voice? You know, does Georgia O'Keeffe's work speak to us? And of course, in some ways it does. And it creates an even more marvelous voice when all the authors when all these painters are sort of speaking together over time. And yet it's so impossible to vocalize. But maybe today's, you know, technological innovations are allowing us in a way to peer in at that voice, even though sometimes it's on mute, whether it's, you know, on Tumblr or Instagram. And so for me, there's always been this thing about recognizing that voice is the voice beyond what we typically understand as a voice. And it's always been about looking almost at the quantum level of our, not even our syllables or our letters, but even the impulses behind wanting to form a little unit. This is so beautiful. I love it. Train's coming through, I know. Holy shit.
We're off the tracks. It's okay.
Yeah, exactly. Oh no, we're on the tracks. And that's part of the voice, right? It's this sound, this rumbling, whether it's an actual figure of technology, you know, it's an announcement of arrival. Because that's part of it, right? And where do we put that? Where does that sound, where does that rumble that's underneath the floor right now live, you know, between a noun and a verb? You know, if we throw in some adjectives, we get fancy with prepositional phrases, is that really going to capture what's now kind of encompassing this? And yet, to just record it and play it will somehow miss something too. So there's a craft to a voice, and I think the first thing is to recognize that the voice that we all use and consider ourselves isn't entirely our own voice. You know, it's one of the things I've explored with all my work. You know, it's if you're in House of Leaves, it's, you know, Zampano has a very specific voice, Johnny Truant has a voice, Pelafina has a voice. Sam and Haley's voices in Only Revolutions are made up of the vernacular of teenagers over the course of 200 years. And in the 50-Year Sword, we recognize that a story that we could read with one voice may be comprised of many, many voices. So even if you're willing to look at yourself through the course of the day, you're going to start to realize that a lot of phrases that you speak are actually the phrases of a parent or a peer, or that came from a certain book, and that we've slowly kind of mashed them together and called it our own, even though all of these kind of constructions are partly not our own. So who is the voice that speaks through us? And that's always the question. And for me, one of the ways of hearing that voice, because we do have a sense that there's something common there, there's something familiar, is beginning to access a wide range of voices. So in the literary boxing ring, probably, you know, my biggest bout is with the monolithic voice. Because one of the comforts of a monolithic voice, whether it's a sacred text or, you know, a powerful, you know, writer, whether it's Homer or Virginia Woolf or Pynchon or others, is that they give you this compelling sound to organize the world, and you feel like in that moment that the world makes sense. And it is one of the great gifts of literature. It is one of the great gifts of great texts, because it kind of placates you and says, it can be arranged, it can be ordered, we can sing the song of our times, of our place, and find peace. But that's really not how it works, you know? What works is that there's a train rumbling by, and there's a cacophony of different languages that we can't quite hear, and sometimes we just become deaf to. You know, we are so good at finding patterns that are familiar and that are our own that we have become completely blind to the dialogue that's going on. I mean, even in this space, think of the mute dialogue that's going on between these paintings and sculpture. I mean, there's a whole dialogue of material and color that's surrounding us. But right now, we're all tuned to a certain grammar and a certain language. So for me, it's about embracing the strangeness, embracing that which is outside of me. And part of it is craft, you know, part of it is instinct, you know, that comes from just doing this for decade after decade. And another is going to Singapore, talking to East LA gang members, you know, sitting in those actual interrogation rooms in Rampart Station in Los Angeles and talking with detectives, you know, and beginning to acquire and learn those songs and hear how they sound, you know. And so, you know, so through that craft, then the larger aim is then to begin to awaken this kind of strange symphony that we are in the middle of. That might be a nice title for tonight, The Strange Symphony, you know? Maybe not, I don't know. You had another part to your question, I think, that I didn't answer. Yeah, I think you know, technology's always been interesting to me, and certainly how it's part of this conversation and how it's kind of another net, if you will, that can capture more aspects is of interest to me, and I think it's part of the dialogue. But I think also technology in particular and voice is especially significant because the familiar really at its heart is concerned with how we place in the world that which not only doesn't have a voice but will never have a voice. You know, how do we situate this planetarity that we, you know, live in? How do we situate the trees and the animals? And, you know, one of the great excuses is that, well, they don't speak like us. If they had a language, then, you know, they would have a right to vote and they would become part of the system. But we who have a voice can often use that voice to deafen our awareness of that which is without a voice, and yet so pertinent to who we are, so germane to who we are. So that at least is the exploration, the beginning of this journey, so to speak. That's the shortest answer I give, by the way. Yes? Never what?
Never spoke to you.
Right.
Douglas Hofstadter, never heard of your book prior to my asking him whether he was ever actually contacted.
Oh, he just forgot.
I actually thought that might be right. But I'm wondering, did you actually get a chance to talk to any of the people that you do reference in House of Leaves in the interview section, or did you go on an exploratory journey of trying to figure out how they might respond to this situation?
Well, you know the answer I'm going to give, and you're going to hate it. There was this trunk, and it was filled with papers. I just did my best to put it together. And Borges, I don't know, Hofstadter, I don't know who those cats are, but I just was like, they sound cool to me, and I'll put them in there, because, you know, that's what it's going to be. I will say the great thing about being a novelist is that it always starts with, this isn't true. You know, one of the lines that I loathe when I see a movie or a book is based on a true story. You know, if you got it, you don't need to say that. You know, the whole point is we're going to start with nothing, and out of that nothing, we're going to make something. And then the kind of valences and vibrations that take place when something that was not comes into being is what, you know, illuminates the imagination, which moves us towards some sense of participation in this greatest, you know, this greater whole. As far as Borges goes, It's an interesting question, but over the years, I hear a question that's, say, of a similar family, and it's always a different author, you know. So it's you know, people could read House of Leaves and say Borges, correct, but they can also read, they can hear Melville, correct. You know what I mean? There's so many kind of voices that infiltrate that text that no one's wrong, but no one is also a completist. And next time you see Mr. Hofstetter, give him my regards. Yes.
In the passage you just read, Xanther talked about how she kind of heard voices. And I was wondering if, out of all the voices that you created in your books, if any of them still stay with you. Like, for example, if you're writing today and all of a sudden you kind of hear Pellegrino whispering in your ear in the background.
Oh, that's such a good question. Voices in my head. So that could be another title. Oh, you're not the first to ask that question. But I'm committed. I promise you, I'm committed to the familiar. You know, it's the one thing about what I do is it takes such a long time. You know, it's this tiny accretion of detail that slowly begins to build a scene, a setting, a character, and there is this moment in the very beginning where you are kind of willfully taking little spatters of ink or graphite or, you know, electric dots and putting them onto the page and making something. And at that moment, it is all voices, really. It's a white noise, like different voices can enter, you know, the scene. Borges can suddenly emerge, you know, Emily Dickinson's there, you know, the guy who used to sell the newspapers on the corner. But then slowly, if it happens, and it has to happen, like with all the characters in the familiar, this happened, they suddenly become their own. And for those of you who are writers, I wish you this experience, and I hope you find this experience, and in fact, you should always find this experience if what you're doing is going to reach a point of completion, where it becomes of you, but no longer you. It becomes wholly invested in whatever you want to call it. It's affect, it's logic, it's just beingness, that you are then under its sway. So Pellegrino will never talk through Xanther's head, unless I invite her, actually. That would be different. Certainly Xanther is a person capable of that. But Sam and Haley will only live as Sam and Haley, and Jing Jing will only speak in his cadences. So they are of their own that it would be so foreign. It would be like a violin suddenly sounding like a tuba. You know, it's possible, but it takes so much work that it itself would be kind of a craft-driven thing. But those characters still live in my head very fully, and it's nice to see them emerge now and then. Say, no. This is not your scene. Yeah. It is raining once again.
So with you keep mentioning Borges, and you said Melville, and you said what people could detect from your books.
Right.
So, what did you draw your inspiration on when you wrote House of Leaves, and what are you drawing on? Is there an overlap to them?
So, I have a narrative about my work, and I'm not going to say that this is the correct narrative, but it's the narrative that puts those books in place for me, okay? And I'm going to tell you what that narrative is. But before I tell you that narrative, I'm going to contradict myself right from the beginning. When I finished writing House of Leaves, and when it came out, I really thought I understood House of Leaves. You know, I'm the author. I'm the guy that did it. I'm no longer sure really how the lightning got in the bottle, and I'm really not sure anymore what the lightning is. It just became of its own. And I realized that I simply had a narrative that made me feel in control of something that soon became beyond my control. But my narrative is as follows. I look at House of Leaves as a journeyman's piece. So I guess you would say I'm highly educated, and I took that education and in the classroom as well as in life and put it quite transparently actually into the book. So House of Leaves is very comprehensive when it lists all of its influences. You can find all the authors that I was accessing at that point. And at that point, I was steeped in the academic philosophies of the 80s, and all of that is apparent, whether we're talking about, Derrida or Bloom. These voices were part of its construction. And out of it, something else was emerging. But I was very much like someone who was working in an atelier, and I was studying under all of these greats, and I was able to put it into this book. From my perspective now, Only Revolutions is a masterwork. I'm not saying it's a masterpiece, but it's the work that did something that hasn't been done anywhere else. And people are only starting to get it. I mean, now people are writing books about it. Now it's like, it's that complicated. It embraces that much the three-dimensionality of the book, the question of image, even though it's not image apparent in some ways, the way it kind of constructs its rhyme schemes across various, chiasmas of pages becomes a kind of a pictorial element as well as a musical element. And there's no handy academic theory that you can easily use to parse what that book is doing. So in that regard, I remain very proud of that book because it continues to kind of create a music as it twists along that you can't hear anywhere else. And it is of our culture and of our time. And that also gets back to the craft question of voice because there was an enormous amount of study that went into tracing those teenage vernacular words and seeing how they paired with the history that was going on. So following that along, the familiar for me then became this thing of like having embraced kind of my conscious education in House of Leaves and then embraced probably my conscious ambition, willfulness in Only Revolutions, because there's a kind of, it's aware of this, but there is this kind of ego-driven narcissism of like, I mean, it's an ego trip. It's two ego trips. It's two kids on an ego trip that are so self-involved that they lay to waste the world around them. That I finally sort of kind of hit the bottom of myself, and I realized this is it. I don't want to be that author. I don't want to be the author that lives in this tiny shack piecing together tiny bits of vocabulary that are ultimately stemming from his own ego. I want to really throw open the windows and the doors. And that's what I started to do. And it was weird because as soon as I kind of found that intention, suddenly opportunities presented themselves. Eerily, actually, just the way I'm in this barn. And suddenly there was an invitation to perform the 50-Year Sword. Suddenly that meant that I had to hire actors, and we suddenly had a production, we had to design things. Suddenly I, the guy who was always by himself, is now having to deal with different personalities, most of whom were very unimpressed by who I was and why the hell was I telling them to stand there or using a conductor's rod or whatever it was. But it was this great kind of creaking apart of an idea of also how a novelist or a writer should look. The familiar then continues that. It begins to be about getting way outside of myself, going to Singapore, listening to what Singlish is, exposing myself to cultures that are way beyond me, to move away from that idea that the only thing that matters is kind of my memoir or my idea of myself, and I'm going to add this little authentic piece to, whatever is being written out there, which, by the way, is legitimate. But for me, the journey was, okay, well, I'm not that interested in me. I'm really more interested in people outside of even books. I'm interested in hearing those vocabularies, those scenes, those motions of feelings that can shape a culture, can shape a family, can shape a country, all of that. And for me, that didn't even begin at all on the page. That just began with a moment of saying, I'm going to get outside. And so the influences really are the world at large. It's really sitting there and talking to detectives. But also, you know, there's a textual part of it as well. So it's reading about what's going on in the LAPD, reading the Straits Times, you know, out of Singapore, listening to LA gang members and whatnot. And so building on this long tradition, which I think is evident in House of Leaves and Only Revolutions and The 50-Year Sword, is sort of investing myself in texts that are beyond me, that are completely strange, you know, and seeing where that leads. And from my perspective, at least, it feels like a good way to go. It feels like a good path to walk, you know. I can't vouch for what it will finally offer. This is certainly the beginning, but it personally has opened doors to new ways of thinking, to new ideas, and things that I wasn't particularly interested in at first, you know? It was like, you know, so how's that for an unfinished answer to a great question? Yes.
In your books, you talk a lot about things